Ramses was in Galveston when she first heard about the myth. It was early May and unseasonably hot, whatever that meant. Out beyond the thin sliver that remained of the island, iron-dark clouds gathered every morning on the horizon, ominous, an omen even. Sign of tribulations to come. That's the line she gave to the locals, and while they didn't buy it, she stirred superstitions they didn't know they had. The holdouts were cranky oilmen who would be damned if some no-drill liberal insurance salesman were going to force them out of vacation homes that had been in their families for generations. Ramses started with a clear statement of her purpose, and then let them rant. She nodded gravely and raised her warm beer to toast their wittier insights. They felt heard. She really sympathized with their concerns. But weren't the bedbugs back this year? She asked. And for dramatic effect, she dug into her armpit with her index finger and pulled out a plump louse. She smeared it bloody on the table. On one hand, she ticked off the costs of extermination, the costs of flood mitigation, the fees of the telcos to maintain coverage, the rescue fines she knew for a fact the state would pass next year. How long would Congress really force the insurance companies, her employers, to honor policies on doomed towns? They were underwater already, they just didn't know it. And Tennessee was really nice these days. Rains were good, and kept the lakes full for boating and fishing and swimming. A housing boom was surely coming, with a pretty penny in it for anyone who could get in on the ground floor. Then Ramses swigged the last of her beer and gave them a long, even look, one she'd perfected negotiating with old, patient Pashtun warlords. The look was about making herself a mirror. Admit it, you know how you'll feel in 10 years. That's how they'd taught it in the Conflict D-esque special school. Ghost of Christmas future shit. Her earnest sympathies unkinked the secret doubts of those damned by history. The buyout wasn't generous, but they took it. The prophet of the myth who came to her was an old army buddy, Jefferson Jackson, of all people. Not special forces, he'd been paired with her unit to rig up quick and dirty solar at every stop, a cheap way to sweeten the pot for the tribesmen she was trying to talk down. It took some gall to walk into drone-scorched houses and ask to futz with the wiring, but somehow Jefferson always came back whole and drunk on Pakistani moonshine. A real character, her CO had called him. Sergeant First Class of talking people to death. How the fuck are ya? Jefferson said, flashing his teeth, some still real, at the camera. His redneck drawl, effect, had thickened in the intervening years. He was out of the army now and had found work as a park ranger back home in Florida. Before she could settle into the small talk, he launched into an enthusiastic pitch she could hardly keep up with. She caught Miami, Benson method, Gators, something about a big project and a favor she didn't remember owing him. And besides, you sound bored as fuck, he concluded. Ramses hadn't said more than 2 words, but it wasn't like he was wrong. She rode her musky rental car back to outer Houston and caught a regional jet to Fort Lauderdale. The new runways for big jets floated steady like Emirati Islands, but her dinky hopper had to land, bumping and skidding, on a shaky platform built on cocked-up shipping containers. The touchdown jarred her, clacking her teeth together painfully. She didn't think she and Miami would get along very well. Jefferson met her at the airport, and they rode out of the city, past a stretch of neon-lit nightclubs. Revelers with mosquito nets over their skimpy club gear stood outside vaping hash and waiting to get in. Jefferson bemoaned the passing of old cowboy-themed swing bars from his misspent youth. They continued west until the nuisance flooding ahead signs became more insistent. Jeff sent the car back, and they continued on in an airboat he'd parked nearby. A jerry-rigged, patched-over beast from the aughts, Jefferson had ripped out the old combustion engine and wired in something Tesla, charged it from a cow-sized solar balloon. Deep into the swamps they rode. The floodlights and full moon cast a spectral pallor on the water and the trees. All of a sudden, Ramses wondered if she was about to get murdered, her body dumped in the water, to be pulled out rotting by some U of F pathology grad. Her spine straightened, situational awareness training rushing back with her macabre fantasy. Everything looked dead and still, though she knew every inch of the Everglades was alive with something. Jefferson whistled tunelessly. A PTSD-fueled serial killer? The affected speech, the forced teaming, the unnecessary details. Ramses had just about convinced herself to make a run for it, evaluating her options for improvised weapons, when they came upon the strangest structure she had ever seen. Squat, spiraling, and conical, The myth looked like old drawings of the Tower of Babel that Ramses had seen paging through her uncle's illustrated Bible as a kid. Except, after being abandoned in the Cambrian explosion of linguistic diversity, the tower had been overgrown by creepier vines and then resettled by hippies and design geeks. Tall and wide as the Superdome, it was covered in moss and ivy and hanging gardens, here and there sprouting long, sturdy branches that jutted out high over the water. Perched atop was a halo, a pristine Mobius loop of solar mirror, gleaming eerie in the moonlight. Ramses peered through the darkness as the airboat trundled forward, trying to understand the prickly, lumpy shape before her. And then, before she could grok it, they were inside, passing through an archway curtained by banyan roots. Inside, the myth was a set of nested domes, massive arching struts supporting wooden platforms, suspended shipping containers, the occasional rope bridge. A flotilla of colorful houseboats jostled together at water level. Illumination was provided by a hodgepodge of bioluminescent globes and dangling strings of LEDs. Here and there, mirrors the size of city buses would flash a reflection of the starry sky above. Ramses thought she saw treehouses in the rafters. A slight, excited-looking woman clad in coveralls reading Sisyphus light hauling waved them in to dock with traffic wands that had probably wandered off from the airport. "What the hell have you brought me to, Jeff?" Ramses said as they tied into the flotilla. She found herself thinking of the Dinotopia book she had read when she was little, and how real cities had disappointed her for years afterwards. The myth looked like a combination botanical gardens, field laboratory, modern art gallery, and Roman bath. Definitely bizarre, but it was also the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Jefferson was fierce-eyed. "This here's the artsy megastructure that better save my gators." Ramsey got the full story over hibiscus tea from Nina Mitra, the aquitect in coveralls who had waved them in. She was young and turquoise-haired, and she spoke in the sort of clipped phrases one hears when genius aims for intelligibility. "We're not Rotterdam, and we're not trying to be," Nina explained. "Florida can't build dikes. Rising seas seep right up through the bedrock we're sitting on. It's all limestone and porous as hell. The state has a water control system of pumps and canals, but the real protector has always been the wetlands. They soften the blows from storms, they absorb the water rise. Living organisms can take in a lot of water, and they shift it around into verticalities it wouldn't go to on its own. Up into leaves and branches, and down in root systems. They can clean it, they can even, with a little help, desalinate it. We're just giving them a boost." Carbon, too, the swamp life took in, building with it, sequestering it in the soil, water, and vegetation. The Everglades pulled poison out of the air more efficiently than a rainforest. To lose it would be to lose the earth a little lung. Jefferson said that Nina had dropped out of 4 PhD programs before she found one that would fund her designs. She'd cut her teeth building tree trenches in the floodplains of Bangladesh before the Indian annexation. She moved like a woman who wanted glasses to fidget with, but, walking around the interior of the myth, she pointed out the most minute plants, insects, and algae stains, all with an explanation of how they fit into the boutique ecosystem they had created. Ramses got the impression that the mousy radical had much better eyesight than the rest of them. With the weather changing faster every day, wetlands all over the world were dying of lost insects, being stripped by hurricane winds, or withering from rising salinity. So, the myth aimed to create a new wetland. Through rapid testing and genetic tweaks, the Aquitect's team of ecosystem hackers was homing in on a combination of swamp grasses, oysters, and thick tropical trees that they believed would turn the sputtering Everglades into an overclocked engine of carbon sequestration, desalination, water filtration, flood mitigation, and topsoil retention, a total package of environmental redemption. The giant watercolor flowcharts they mapped the passage of carbon, nitrates, and methane gas through their synth-bio proving ground. Drop in the right algae bloom, and pH levels would slowly stabilize. Prod the microbiome into a different shape, and the new wetland would stop releasing methane. Swap a gene, and the mangroves would snake up any man-made support struts. They dragged in hulking beams salvaged from abandoned shipyard cranes and Disney World's roller coaster boneyard. 200 feet high, they coaxed the swamp, wispy trees aching to touch a threatening sky. The new wetland not only survived the harsher environs provided by climate change, it positively thrived in them. It thrived because, and this was a crucial point for Nina, the new wetland was made of weeds. No, not like kudzu, she insisted, describing their selective use of Terminator seeds for bad actors. Globalized weeds, adapted for a new world. They scattered, adapted, resisted, and survived. And like any good weed, the new wetland wanted to spread. The myth wasn't just their laboratory, it was their working prototype. Nina wanted to take it to scale. "That's where you come in," she said to Ramses as they finished their tour. Hacking the Everglades was a project that would take a generation. It required a coalition of committed partners from the surrounding communities, suburban developers and sprawl salvagers, semi-legal hunters and pseudo-official wildlife enthusiasts like Jefferson, tour guides, business owners, transients, natives. They all had to be sold the unlikely story that southern Florida could be saved. In fact, could be made vital to the planet. The smart money figures the Everglades are doomed and wants to profit off what comes next. The dumb money refuses to face the facts. Nina shrugged and added, "Then there's us. We'd be the weird money, if we had money." "But what's with the creepy cult name?" Ramses asked finally. "The myth has all the wrong connotations for something I need to sell people on." Nina smiled, embarrassed. "I joked that what I really wanted was to build a magnificent temple to the human spirit. Someone on email started abbreviating it, MTHS. From there, pretty soon everyone just called it the myth." Ramses laughed. For all their crazy person talk of hope and optimism, the myth people were still just project dorks. She could live with that. So she set off, riding Jeff's airboat from Homestead to Big Cypress, from Boca Raton down to what was left of the Keys. She started with the park rangers and the land management officers. Like all outpost bureaucrats since the dawn of civilization, these lonely feds felt abandoned, exiled to the edge of a crumbling empire. With Jefferson's example to follow, they were more than happy to exercise their small but rarely challenged prerogative by looking the other way. The tour guides were easy, better a mutant sleeping beauty Bramblewood than a salt-withered plain of dead sludge. The hunters she left to Jefferson. His preternatural obsession with alligators, birthed during an ayahuasca trip the week he got back from Pakistan, carried real weight with the kind of men who liked the ritual of wading, camo-clad, through waist-deep swamp water. For 6 months, the Seminoles wouldn't talk to her. She kept at it, though, stopping by periodically to introduce herself, get the ceremonial haranguing, and gamely lose a few dollars in their casinos. Relationships before transactions, opportunities for the youth. Eventually, they had a deal. She was a year in when the state caught wind of their operation. They rolled up to the myth in a swarm of quadcopters, Navy windbreakers billowing like pufferfish. A full platoon of special investigators, armed with clipboards and cameras. They shuffled through the studios, laboratories, and meditation spaces, murmuring and shaking their heads. Classic shakedown tactics. Nina cussed like a sailor, then seethed quietly. Jefferson was nowhere to be found, preserving deniability. Ramses decided to meet them, with tea, in the bright slab of Victorian garden beneath the very center of the solar loop. "This is a very interesting piece of something you have here," the alpha male said, sitting down. He introduced himself as special advisor to the Governor Mitchell Foote, "Call me Mitt," and he stirred 3 sugars into his tea. "I dig the green Guggenheim, Richard Serra does falling water, kind of deal. And the inside, well, it's a very contemporary statement, with the big mirrors and the rogue genetics laboratories. Thing is, ain't none of it permitted." Ramses leveled a long size-you-up stare. He looked like a bodyguard put out to pasture, buzz-cut, with wraparound sunglasses pushed up to a widow's peak. Foote clearly enjoyed the cognitive dissonance of this culture critic spiel. "And what permits exactly would we need?" Ramses asked. "We have a bit of an unorthodox situation here." "Hell, that's one way of putting it. Just from a first pass, we got unlicensed synth bio, introduction of foreign invasive species, and a lot of people camped out here in this structure that I'm guessing ain't up to code, whatever code we end up applying." Foote leaned back and put his feet up on an empty chair. Ramses guessed he was coming into the home stretch of his pitch, and decided to let him get it out of his system. "Now, I'm from Miami. Let me tell you, Miami is a very cultured town. I grew up on Art Basel, and of course the state of Florida has always offered a home to all sorts of people with questionable judgment, so we're willing to work with you. But boy, there's going to be a lot of paperwork. We'll get some lawyers down here. Now, take it from me, you'll want to get all that expedited so we don't have to shut you down in the meantime. I'm not going to lie to you, that might get a little pricey." Ramses cleared her throat. "I'm afraid we don't have any money." "No money?" Foote furrowed his brow. This was apparently a wrinkle he hadn't foreseen. "How do you pay all these people? How do you feed them? Where do you get all these building materials from? They're volunteers. We grow food on the premises. We salvage and scrap. Well, shit. That's no good. Foot looked genuinely worried. You got any investors? What's the long play on this thing? Avant-garde art spa? What are the revenues on that scheme? Nina piped up, speaking for the first time. I think you misunderstand the nature of our work. We're an environmental reclamation project. We're using ecological infrastructure to provide clean water to the areas affected by the salt rise in the water table. You're messing around with the water? Shit, if I'd known you were going to stir up trouble. We've published our results, Nina protested. Test the water around here. You can drink it, right out of the swamp. We're actually trying to save your ill-advised city. If you don't do something... See, there you go. Causing trouble already, Foot interrupted her. You can't just go around talking about saving Miami. That presumes known menace and imminent imperilment, threats we are then liable to address. We've got investors to consider. No one wants to buy a timeshare in a place that needs saving. This was a startling declaration. Ramses concluded that debating the merits of ecological megaprojects was not a winning strategy, and tried to tack back to what Foot really wanted. So, about expediting that paperwork? Foot poured himself another cup of tea, 4 sugars this time. Right, well, it seems to me the state of Florida might be able to get on board with your little project here, but we need to be reassured that you aren't going to run out of money halfway through some critical chromosomal manipulations. My recommendation is, get yourself a fiscal sponsor, some nice billionaire who can put our lawyers at ease and grease the right wheels. I'll give you a couple weeks, but don't make me haul out here without a payday again. Surprising no one, such a fiscal sponsor emerged a few days later. Bodhi Chakrabarti had made his fortune mass-marketing brain-boosting herbal supplements to teens. He then declared that he would use his billions to save the planet, and promptly started his own reality show. Film crew in tow, he arrived unannounced, providing color commentary as he led himself on a tour of the myth. Wow, just wow, am I right? What you guys are doing here, so inspirational. I can't wait to get involved. Together, we are going to make such a change for people. Together, Chakrabarti preened for the cameras. Ramses expected him to put on a show, and then, off-camera, haggle over the terms of the value exchange. But there was no off-camera for Chakrabarti. He broadcast his every move. This was not how they liked to work. Wasn't move quietly and plant things, as Nina liked to say. Ramses had hoped to squeeze the state's payoff out of Chakrabarti and send him home with promises of, at most, monthly updates. Instead, he was talking about picking out offices and trying to haul his yacht overland. The hair on the back of her neck rose. This was a corporate takeover. She hedged. She kept things polite and vague for the cameras. When he'd finally gone, Ramses, Nina, and Jeff held court at the tea tables. Jefferson said what they were all thinking. Y'all, we're gonna need some fucking backup. The Renegade Olympics of 2040 were accessible only by ship or seaplane. Ramses, Nina, and Jeff borrowed an aging sailboat from a retired couple and cruised down past Cancun to the flotilla parked a few hundred miles west of Jamaica. The games would be held on the deck of the Emma Maersk, once the largest container ship in the world. In 2031, Maldivian activist pirates commandeered it off the coast of Singapore, rigged it with solar, loaded up 20,000 refugees, and sailed around South America in a highly televised 2-month international incident. The Emma Maersk was the perfect venue because A, most of the world's governments were determined to pretend that it didn't exist, and B, all the events in the Olympics were games that could be played in a refugee camp. This meant football, rugby, basic track and field, wrestling, some swimming, and shipping container parkour. Sailing into the fleet, they were greeted by a riot of strange flags. The Olympics were the premier diplomatic event for the world's aspiring non-states. The Maldivians, of course, but also the Kurds, the Tibetans, the Palestinians, Western Saharans, Cypriot nationalists, Cascadian separatists, the Quebecois, and 100 other displaced groups, even the scary, militant sea peoples, playing hosts and MCs to them all, the Cubans. The 21st century had been rough for Cuba. The future shock when the embargo fell was intense, and American developers sensed tender prey. The first free elections were easily bought. It was starting to look like the mob years all over again. Hurricane Bethel changed all that. The freak superstorm hit Cuba's north coast like a runaway jackhammer, slamming against the island from Baracoa to Remedios to Havana. Pastel paint was stripped from colonial walls. 57 Bel Airs were swept out to sea. The Malecon was reduced to rubble. Smelling blood in the water, corporate interests accelerated their shock doctrine plans, but the emergency response had re-energized both the crumbling revolutionary bureaucracy and black market networks that had held society together during the Periodo Especial. The gospel of Fidel, Che, and Camilo found its reformation. The Cuban people had a long history of not doing what Americans wanted them to do. Luxury hotels were seized to house the homeless. Sympathetic space jumpers hacked broadband gloons in a series of daring, high-altitude maneuvers. It looked like a standoff, but neither side wanted to return to the bad days of the 20th century. The seas were rising, islands were a bad investment. The powers that be settled for deals on coffee and rum. The Cubans gained a reputation as dashing climate resistance gurus. "Comrades, I got your email," the tattooed and pierced commissioner of the Olympics, nom de guerre Mickey Cienfuegos, spoke the kind of perfect English that was half Benedict Anderson, half Run the Jewels. He greeted them with mojitos, weed, and enthusiastic bear hugs. "Let me break it down for you. Resistance in the 21st century is all about two things: infrastructure and attention. First, you cannot depend on global supply lines for anything. Power, bandwidth, water, food, sewage. They will cut you off and starve you out. We grow some vegetables and farm oysters," Nina said. "We could do rice if we're really pressed." "Oysters? Sick!" Mickey fist pumped. "Imagine the optics. State troopers camped out all around you, eating donuts, while inside you dine on raw oysters. Home run!" Nina shot him a grin that Ramses read as, "Ease up on the hero of the people shtick, and maybe we'll compare piercings later." "Okay, second thing," Mickey continued. "Put your story out to the masses. Get a fan base. Cops don't want that Ruby Ridge shit. Not if you have 1 million+ followers. Don't talk to any journalists. First mistake every occupier makes. Do it grassroots. Viralismo." "That's not really our style," Ramsey said. "How are we supposed to find a following in time? Have you looked around? You're not the biggest counter-globalization media event in the world. I'll put you on stage. I'll make you a star. Can you run fast, jump high, climb containers? Let's get you down on the field with some hot, photogenic refugee boys. Floridians. Come for help from the likes of us? People will eat that shit up. In fact," Mickey said, spreading his arms magnanimously, "I might even post about you on my blog." The games were indeed a big PR coup for the myth. They ladled out water to sprinters. They were honorary referees during the exhibition rugby match. Gorka Land vs. Holy See. They made a music video with the young, hip, Dharamsala Dalai Lama. Jefferson was particularly popular, crying wet crocodile tears about the plight of his beautiful, endangered Florida gators. After closing ceremonies, Mickey's ship, the Great Grandma, towed them north. 2 days after they got back, Foote came to confront them. "What the fuck, you guys?" Foote called, when his airboat was in shouting distance. "I told you, don't make any trouble. Come up with some money. A week later my daughter shows me your fucking music video. You're dancing around with pirates and probably terrorists. You've definitely forced my hand here." The Mythers pulled up ramps and blockaded the entry arches. State drones moved to surround them. Foote, on a bullhorn now, demanded a parley. For the sake of maximum theater, Ramses and Nina decided that Jefferson would deliver their promise. He stepped out onto a balcony in park ranger uniform. His gray shirt was pressed and his tie was knotted, though he'd made cut-offs of the olive pants. "First, this here's national park territory, and I got some jurisdiction over that shit. 2, we got food and water aplenty, so we're happy to wait. 3, water here is chock full of my gators. Let me tell you, they're strong. I've wrestled them myself." Behind a barricade, Nina and Ramses were cracking up. 4, Mickey here is broadcasting your every fucking move. We see one gun drawn, and a fleet of terrifying sea peoples will descend on you like the cataclysmic days of fucking yore. Mickey waved, holding up his camera. "Say hello to my little friend," he quoted. Ramses wondered just how much the sea people's bit was a bluff. 5, we got power. Y'all are tied to the goddamn grid. See that big, beautiful IUD up there? I built that shit. Pulls down 2,800 kilowatt hours. Jefferson tapped his phone and "Where the Devil Don't Stay" by drive-by truckers boomed out from the Myth's PA system. "Can't tax the sun. Copper," he crooned. "This is the most Florida shit I have ever seen," Nina said. Ramses had assumed that being under siege would either be very scary or very boring, but instead she was just busy. First, there was the siege itself, which needed to be monitored and physically repelled. While Foote called for reinforcements, they plugged holes and set guard shifts. That first night, drones prodded their defenses, and they had to raise their voices to be heard over the buzz. The second night, the incursions began. The quadcopters, they could shoo away with a leafy branch, but the crawling drones had to be spotted and caught in hemp sacks before they could chew through any wiring. By the third night, Foot had gotten hold of a pair of submersible drones, which swam under their gates and caused some minor havoc in the houseboat flotilla. These they lassoed with some animal control gear Jeff had stashed in a locker and released gently back into the wild. Then there was their broadcast, which Mickey assured them was their best defense against an actual armed assault. It wasn't enough to just live stream the stadies camped out around them. They had to keep their viewers entertained. They did question and answer sessions in online forums. Nina led camera tours of the Myth's facilities, and Ramses recited her pitch for the new wetland project every time they had a big changeover in viewership. They shared oyster recipes and tips for mutant gardening. They reenacted their music video. Anything to keep enough eyes on their stream. Mickey kept a weather eye on the news cycles and every few hours would advise them to loop in or comment on some trending topic. Staying viral meant continually reinfecting supporters' filter bubbles with their agenda. But Labor Day was coming up, and Mickey worried that, without major action to regalvanize attention, an attack by Foot would get lost in holiday news dump. They were starting to brainstorm ways to shake up the standoff when they got the flash advisory. A Luxembourg-sized chunk of Antarctic ice was shearing off, collapsing 200 billion tons into the sea. By some cruel twist of currents, sea rise happened first and steepest in the northern Caribbean, so Floridians had learned to pay attention to these ice shelf events. But this one was different. This one came with a storm. Emergency alerts buzzed on both sides of the siege, yielding a moment of frenetic peace as everyone checked their phones and goggles. Tropical storm Nix would make landfall in 36 hours. The governor has declared a state of emergency, Foot announced through his bullhorn as the state airboats began to pull away. We're moving agency resources where most needed, but, don't go anywhere. He paused, adding, and don't think this is over. Out of the frying pan into the deluge, Jeff muttered before they set about getting ready. It's not Babel, thought Ramses, looking at their mangrove fortress. It's the Ark. The seas rose and the rains came. The levees broke. The waters prevailed upon the earth. Rich and poor alike sought shelter, but the rich happened to have helicopters. A lot of people took their chances on the highways. Others sheltered in place, hoping it was just another storm. But when the rains died away, the water didn't drain. It rose, bubbling up out of lawns and drains like a salty, stinking sweat. Miamians came to the Myth by the hundreds, drawn by rumors of fresh water and just blind hope. They came in dinghies and speedboats, rafts made from water jugs, and one ratty old kiddie pool a father carried his children in. Nina worked around the clock to preserve the plants that cleaned their water. Ramses didn't see her stop moving for more than 10 minutes at a time. Jeff did a lot of search and rescue, checking in on neighbors and bringing gallon jugs of drinking water to friends. Sometimes he'd come back grinning, with a story of saving a dog that had gotten up into a tree. Just as often, though, he didn't talk about what he found out there, shuffling to his bunk with eyes clouded by trauma. Ramses saw a lot of eyes like that week. Ramses had never thought of herself as maternal. She'd always dated people more femme than she was. But something unclenched inside her as she cleaned out scrapes, soothed crying children, and wrapped shivering old women in blankets. When she ran away from home 2 decades prior, it had been the concerned attentions of a recruitment office receptionist that had stopped her spiraling. She channeled that memory. She forged a new look, one dispelling debasement by seeing another as fully human. She deployed it for each boat of refugees that arrived, and the clouds in their eyes would clear for a moment. Ramses felt so present with everyone. She was almost lightheaded. Finally, Jefferson took her aside. Sergeant, you might have weapons-grade emotional intelligence, but you need to stop and sleep a couple hours. He was right, but she wasn't the only one. A lot of tired, scared people needed places to sleep. They hung hammocks and tossed out lab equipment. Pretty soon they found themselves cutting down trees and pulling down parts of the tower to fashion crude shelters. When the Coast Guard got on the scene on day 3, they relied on sit-reps from the Myth. Ramses and Jeff traded off on a shortwave radio, relaying messages and coordinating support. Donations came in, both virtual and physical. Mountains of perishables needed to get eaten or composted. Well-meaning volunteers had to be assigned jobs. They ran low on the strangest things. The Cubans showed up in a major way, mostly because Mickey was obsessed with symbolically reversing the Mariel boat lift. It was scary. It was thrilling. They didn't quite notice the number of news drones that had gathered. By the time most of the pieces were picked up, the myth was a cause célèbre, not only for taking in the refugees, but also for absorbing the water rise before it inundated more of the peninsula. New wetlands were being pitched all over the global south, with less care and more speed than any of them found advisable. The state left them alone now, or approached them with a certain amount of trepidation. They'd become swamp people, proud, mysterious, uncooperative with authority. Saviors of Tampa, huh? Nina rolled her eyes at the headline. Probably preserved some very historic chain restaurants for future generations. Nina had taken the myth's dismantling the hardest and expressed it in sharper, darker humor. What do you think happens to them? Jefferson gestured at the swarm of floating hexayurts and slurped down a breakfast oyster. Doesn't sound like government or insurance have an appetite to rebuild Miami. I'm sure someone like me is out there, Ramses said ruefully. Probably selling them the Tennessee dream. Well, shit, we should probably recruit them. Worked on you, didn't it? In the frantic days after Nix, the myth had been mostly disassembled as they traded magnificence for subsistence. Container labs became dormitories. The Roman baths became camp latrines. The halo was taken apart to make solar roofing. It was haphazard at first, but after a few weeks a kind of order emerged. Rice was planted. The oyster farms expanded. For the kids, school was organized. Nina taught classes on the botany and art history behind the myth. Soon, grown-ups were showing up for her seminars, too. I've been thinking, Nina said over another mollusk breakfast. What if Tennessee decides they're full? Who knows if these people are going anywhere? It could be years, for all we know. They're going to get the basics, but they'll want something to do. I already have people asking when we'll reconstruct the tower. Maybe we should have them build something. Jeff was alarmed. You've got the gleam in your eye that says you're going to get us into the shit. Ramses reached for a half shell, held it up. Come on, Jefferson. We've got boats. We've got the sun. The world is our oyster. They groaned at her pun, but it wasn't like she was wrong. Their strange, swampy refugee town wasn't beautiful like the myth, but it bustled with ever more activity. A new kind of new wetland. One where humans were not just cultivators, but a dependent part of the ecosystem. We've lost a monument, Ramses thought, but found a movement. The morning light rose over the rice fields and mutant mangroves and hit the solar panels on their roofs. She could almost feel the hum of power, waking up their machines. The sky was clear. The sun would shine strong all day. An omen. A promise.